In this video, I will argue why one of the most hated individuals in human history should not just be considered a human, but a god. By the end of this video, I will convince you that Adolf Hitler belongs in the same category as Jesus, Hades, Hercules, Osiris, Vinci, Dionysus, and many other gods of old. Obviously, the most important part of this video is going to be how we define God. And to be clear, I will define what God is and what God is not. My definition of God is as follows. Gods throughout history have been an attempt to explain the dynamic of the human psyche. Gods are representations of a human psychological function and how that function has evolved over thousands of years. So let me provide a few lines of evidence to support these claims. The first, and I think most powerful, is that gods have changed as the structure of our brains have changed. The earliest spiritual tradition was animism, and animism is a full permeation of meaning into the universe. This coalesced over thousands of years into polytheism, eventually leading to monolatry and monotheism that we see today. These changes actually mimic changes in the structure and complexity of the brain. For example, thousands of years ago, the human experience of reality was primarily mediated through the right hemisphere. This hemisphere represents a unique style of engagement with the world, one that is much more holistic, one that sees the individual as part of something larger. This is exactly how primitive cultures recognize themselves. They recognize themselves as a part of nature, as an integral part of nature, something that could not be removed from it. As the left hemisphere expanded and became more complex, the human mind was more fixated on the particulars. These changes are not only recorded in mythology, but they're also recorded in the asymmetries of the brain that we see today. My second line of evidence to support the notion that gods are a representation of a human psychological function is that gods can be interacted with through certain activation patterns of the human brain. Traditional methods of interacting with gods include psychedelic, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, fasting, and meditative prayer. These methods have been identified in hundreds of spiritual traditions, from Christianity to Buddhism to shamanism. As I mentioned before, all these methods result in a similar brain activation pattern. This altered state of consciousness is oftentimes filled with these same exact characters that we've seen throughout mythological history. Many people report seeing gods or giant snakes or the Garden of Eden or trees of life while they're experiencing an altered state of consciousness. They also tend to report an experience of bliss or oneness with the world. This is one line of evidence to support the fact that gods are a production of the human mind, or at least experienced as psychological entities. Whether or not gods can be identified as real or not is beyond the scope of this video. My third line of evidence is that at a certain psychological depth, these gods become nearly identical and universal across many people. Carl Jung observed in his patients that many saw similar mythological motifs pop up either in their dreams or through hallucinations. He noticed that these mythological motifs were extremely similar across different cultures and different mythological stories. And this is despite the client or the patient having no understanding or no conscious awareness of the existence of these narratives. He saw this as evidence that his clients were bringing forth various symbols and mythological ideas that were kind of universal. My last line of evidence is that when analyzing certain mythological narratives, we see unquestionable similarities. Despite originating from various cultures, various time periods, and various parts of the world, many myths have nearly identical characters, whether it's Jesus and Dionysus, Quetzalcoatl and Osiris. Similar characters exist in many spiritual traditions. So there are a few things to note about my previous definition of a god. First is that a god is one layer removed from the function. A god is a representation of the function of the mind that we're talking about, not the function of the mind itself. The second thing I want to note is that there's no rule that gods have to be inherently good. Gods can be good, they can be evil, or they can be neutral. With this in mind, let's consider Adolf Hitler. Does he meet the criteria to be a god? So I think we can actually begin this answer with a question. If Adolf Hitler never existed, would we have seen similar atrocities arise in Europe? Personally, I think the answer is very clear. We would have seen similar atrocities, not identical ones, but very similar ones. And somebody probably similar to Hitler would have assumed power over Germany. But why is that? It's because Hitler embodied human psychology at this moment in history. He was a condensed version of human consciousness in the mid-1900s. But obviously this begs the question, what separates Hitler from other world leaders? Aren't they all embodiments of the collective to some extent? This is true, but my argument is not that Hitler embodied certain social values or that his passionate speeches resonated with his followers. I'm arguing that Hitler's rise to power was a product of an overdeveloped ego that came into focus in the 1900s. He represented a particular function of the human mind, a particular psychological reality in its full power. The remainder of this video will be dedicated to proving that this connection exists. A very common term to describe the ego in the world of psychology is totalitarian. The ego sits at the control panel of our lives, at least most of the time. It is who we think we are. It is the center of our awareness. It's who we identify as. Our ego, however, exists among many other aspects of who we are. Many other, you can call them personalities. For example, when you're sad, in many ways you're embodied by a different person. This includes psychological function and physiological markers. For example, when you're angry, your blood pressure might go up, you might sweat a little bit, and your cognitive functioning is going to be extremely different. In a sense, you're embodied by a different aspect of who you are. The popular slogan, "You're not you when you're hungry," is an echo of this fact. Identifying the ego as totalitarian in nature is not just a good way to understand human psychology, it also helps us make a connection to Nazi Germany. Evidence to support this notion is as follows, and it comes primarily from a paper written by psychologist Anthony Greenwald titled The Totalitarian Ego. So there are three primary functions that give the ego the categorization as being totalitarian. The first is egocentricity. There are two lines of evidence presented for this. The first is that memories are oftentimes organized in relation to the ego. For example, memories are better able to be encoded and remembered if the person considers the implications of this memory to themselves, how it relates to them during the memorization process. So in essence, if the ego is at the center of that memory, it's going to remember it more often. The second line of evidence is cause and effect. The ego often attributes itself as the cause to things that it couldn't have been the cause of. A good example of this is actually winning a lottery ticket. Someone who wins the lottery might attribute it to the fact that they volunteer often and that they have in some way been rewarded. Another line of evidence is the fact that when people are in a group project setting where they have to work in a group, they often rate their contributions to the group higher than their own group members rate their contributions. The second function of the ego is called benefactance, and this is the ego's tendency to take credit for good things but ignore bad things. A good example of this is that students are more likely to disagree with a bad grade than they are to disagree with a good grade, despite the probability of their work being overvalued is identical to the probability of their work being undervalued. Another good example is that when drivers get into car accidents, they are extremely likely to bend reality to make it seem as if the responsibility does not lie on them. Their ego doesn't want to take credit for a poor experience or a poor outcome. The last line of evidence for this is that we're actually more likely to remember things that we did well than we are to remember things that we did poorly. The third function of the ego that gives us this title of being totalitarian is conservatism. The ego is very reluctant to change its mind and will shift history or memory in order to conform to its beliefs. This comes in the form of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. Now, looking back at Nazi Germany, we can actually identify every single one of these criteria, proving it was a large-scale representation of the totalitarian ego, with Adolf Hitler at its center. Nazi Germany attempted to manipulate history to serve its political goals. The regime controlled education and media, promoting their ideology and suppressing dissenting viewpoints. Historical artifacts and monuments that didn't align with Nazi beliefs were destroyed or altered. These actions were a fundamental aspect of the Nazi regime and clearly represent the egocentric aspect of memory organization in relation to oneself. The Nazis also claimed credit for things that they didn't do, such as the expansion of the German economy in the 1930s, when in reality this was largely due to the rearmament program, which was funded by the state and led to increased military spending and a temporary boost in employment and production. The Nazis also claimed that the idea of an Aryan race was their own, but the concept had existed in various forms for centuries prior to the Nazi regime. These are both examples of the Nazi regime taking credit for things that they actually hadn't done. In category 3, we have some evidence for cognitive conservatism. First, the Nazis sought to reunite German-speaking regions of Europe under a single government and to promote the old idea of a German national identity. The Nazis sought to promote the traditional family structure with the husband at the head of the household and the wife as the homemaker, and to discourage alternate forms of family structure and relationships. The Nazis also promoted physical fitness and athleticism as an important aspect of national strength and vitality. These are all examples of cognitive conservatism, a dogmatic preservation of old ideas and a reluctance to even consider new ones. The last similarity I want to emphasize is the one between egocentrism and propaganda. According to psychologist Anthony Greenwald, whose paper we've relied on heavily in this video, the ego, with all of its characteristics, is a mechanism for organizing knowledge. This organizational methodology includes putting itself at the center, manipulating history for its benefit, taking responsibility for positive outcomes, and rigorously holding on to beliefs. Similarly, political philosopher Hannah Arendt described totalitarian political propaganda not as having a goal of persuasion, but of organization. She said the propaganda does not present facts, but rather a distorted view of reality, designed to shape public opinion and create a climate of support for the regime. This is identical to how the ego does not present facts, rather it only holds on to things to support its own worldview and identity, and it will manipulate things to ensure that that remains true. At the center of the egotistical Nazi regime stood history's most hated man, commonly characterized as not only egotistical, but detrimentally close-minded, so much so that he would ignore his generals' recommendations and even went as far as to disband them if they dared disagree with his narrative. Ultimately, the end of Hitler's story could not be more properly written, as the worldview and identity that Hitler built not only for himself, but for an entire country began to crumble. Reality was too difficult to bear. His ego constructed the narrative that he was at the center of history, that he was the chosen ruler of a new perfect race. As this began to crack, an ego with no ability to integrate this contradictory evidence could no longer exist. Just like other tragic narratives of long-forgotten gods, Hitler's story ends in infamy and solidifies his place in an ever-expanding pantheon of gods who represent the best and worst aspects of human psychological existence.